Hi everyone. I thought it was time for another update about the Daniel Carter Beard Bridge, a Big Mac bridge that was subject to a huge fire from a playground that ignited below the bridge on November 1st. I'm recording this video on Wednesday, November 20th. I've got a lot of news updates. Also, I commissioned my own drone flight that was done yesterday on November 19th, so we got a lot of great images there. I want to thank Cincinnati Drone Photos for performing that work for me. As a reminder, this fire was very intense. And early on, Ohio DOT officials indicated that that section of bridge deck, as well as the girders, would likely need to be replaced, and that seemed fairly obvious. But there's growing frustration with the local population, with politicians, about the apparent slowing of the pace to get this bridge reconstructed and open back up to traffic. And I'll go through those details. Let's just start out with an overall aerial view of what's going on here. This playground was in a city park, Sawyer Point Park, underneath the I-471 bridge. Right now, the traffic is allowed to use the northbound lanes only at this point. You can see the area of the road closure right now. Orange highlight is the location of the park that's currently closed and does not have public access. As a reminder, this is what the playground looked like before the fire. A lot of plastic, looks like rubber matting, and it produced an extremely intense fire. So Ohio DOT has been providing updates at their website, I-471 Media Center. There was an update yesterday afternoon. They indicate that the contractor, Great Lakes Construction, has been working continuously since the fire to expedite an emergency repair for the project. Before detailed inspections for the bridge could be performed, they had to support an unstable section of I-471. They did that with these steel support towers to form falsework to support the damaged portion of the bridge. And I thought they were going to put in 2 lines of these supports. And I was surprised that so far they've only put 1 line in. I figured they would have put 2 lines in with the damaged section in between so that they'd be in a good position to remove the entirety of the damaged span. And the update from yesterday indicates that given the scope of work to design the project and acquire materials for the repair, a final timeline for construction and reopening of the bridge has not yet been developed. What's taken so long? I mean, I can appreciate the fact that there's other areas that they're assessing for potential damage that may need to be replaced. I would have thought they would have adopted a worst case scenario mindset and said, if this is the most that we have to repair, this is how long it's going to take, to at least put an upper bound on the repair timeline. And if it goes faster, then great. That seems like pretty basic project management to me, but I'm not sure why they would be reluctant to do that unless there's some key bit of information that they think they need. It strikes me that they may be finessing their analysis here a little bit to emphasize more cost savings rather than expediting construction schedule. And I'll explain why I think that could be the case. So there's a good article about what's going on with the status of this project. There was a city council hearing yesterday, and it was attended by ODOT officials who were answering questions and frankly didn't provide a lot of detailed answers or clear responses to the questions that were being asked. But I've got a link to this article in the description. And as I mentioned, there's growing frustration. City Councilman Seth Walsh was quoted in this article. "I'm just going to be candid. I'm a little frustrated hearing the tenor of this conversation that the words don't seem to match how we are acting right now," Walsh said. "We say we are working as fast as we can, but the fire was November 1st. We didn't get underneath the bridge to inspect it until November 15th by what you just told us here. Most of the answers are, I don't know, we don't know, we're not sure, and I understand that the bridge is complicated, it's structural, we have to make sure we get it right, but look at how many reporters are here, look at how many questions we get about this constantly." At the end of this video, I'm going to break down the list of questions that I think could be asked or should be asked by local media and local politicians of Ohio DOT. So other reporting indicated that during this inspection that started on November 15th, samples, destructive samples, were taken of the steel girders and possibly other materials. And ODOT was also quoted as saying that they found from these inspections that the damage was more extensive than they thought. And apparently they were thinking that they were going to have to only replace these outside 3 girders. But now it looks like they may have to replace some of these interior girders. Again, I figured that would have been a given, that all these girders in this span, as well as the bridge deck, would have to be removed and replaced. I mean, you bring up a reliability issue if you leave some things that were exposed to the fire in place. You also could take a lot of extra time figuring out the potential for reuse versus just getting it out of the way. Again, I believe the critical path for completing this construction is going to be the fabrication of these steel girders. They have to get a mill order in, and typically that takes 6 to 8 weeks to place a mill order and get it fulfilled. And so I can't imagine why they wouldn't have just planned to replace all those girders. There could have been a secondary question as to whether the interface between girders outside that span were also damaged. I could allow for that. But to just think that perhaps you wouldn't have to replace all the girders underneath this section that was exposed to fire seems counterproductive at the very least, I would say. You know, it's, I think, partly because engineers are trained and have experience to try and optimize designs in terms of what's the minimum structure that you can build to support the given load, what's the most cost-effective way to do it. I don't think engineers are tasked too many times in their career with how can we get this done as quickly as possible, and essentially money's no object. And we know money's always an object, but I suspect that the indirect economic impacts from this bridge closure is far greater than what the material cost would be for a few extra girders in a span here. You know, I had experience with this one time. Back in the 90s, I worked for a company that had a client that was a utility that owned a nuclear power plant, and this plant was forced into an outage because of an issue with its circ water system, the circulating water system that's used to cool the reactor. And this water was pumped from a lake through the reactor and then back out to the lake. And they had to shut it down to do work on this circ water system. And because this was in a time of year at a location that could have been subject to tornadoes because of Nuclear Regulatory Commission rules and plant rules, they had to provide what was called missile protection. If they exposed circulating water lines, they had to have a means of covering it in case there was a tornado warning. And the system they used were 1-inch thick steel plates, not unlike those that you would see the deck plates on a bridge or a roadway that was undergoing some kind of repair. Like, let's say they cut a utility trench and that work was ongoing, so they did it in the morning and maybe they put a cover plate over it to allow traffic. And because a tornado would produce low pressures, this plate could have been subject to high uplift forces. So these had to be anchored into the ground. So they had anchors with nuts that would screw down on top of the plate to secure it over the excavation over the circ water line. And we pretty quickly figured out to install all the anchors that it would take to cover this excavation would take a minimum of 3 weeks. And that was critical path. And instead I suggested, hey, why don't you get 10 trucks full of gravel, park them next to the excavation. If there's a tornado warning, you can come in and end dump it, backfill the trench and provide missile protection to the circ water lines. And you do that far quicker than installing these plates. So they loved that idea. They had actually told us, think outside the box, money's no object. And it was a key part to successfully completing that work in a very short time frame. Well, rewind or go past a few weeks, I'm actually in Cambodia. And as soon as I walk into my hotel room in Cambodia, I get a phone call from the procurement officer for that utility saying, hey, we just got a bill for $100,000 for this backfill and we never used it. And what should we do? I said, pay it. You know, you save way more than that by getting the plant up in operation at least 3 weeks sooner. So anyway, I tell that story to illustrate that I don't understand why they couldn't just said, hey, let's just treat this as worst case. Let's start working here. And I would have thought the demo work would have started a lot sooner than now. And if any surprises came up, they would know sooner rather than later. So I think that is a fair criticism, that they may be trying to finesse this a little bit too much. I'm all for a solid engineering approach, but again, I think you can more support the idea of taking out all the girders that were exposed to this heat, not just the ones that have visible damage, in order to expedite the construction, because it's going to be far more cost effective and by getting traffic restored to that area sooner rather than later. So let's look at an overview of what's been done to date. So they brought in Great Lakes. They started putting in their false work tower. They removed the sign truss on the southbound lanes. And then they've done the hands-on bridge inspection. They've taken samples, sent them out for testing. Those results are still pending. Next steps, opening up an additional lane on the northbound side. Material and fabrication of beams will be completed in a timely manner. Okay, I'll cover that here in a bit. Updating on, or actually not updating, providing a schedule for completion of this work. And this shows the formwork for the concrete footing that was used to support these false work towers. It was 6 towers in a line. And again, they only installed a single line of the support. I want to thank a channel viewer, Ken, who sent me these photos when he was walking through the area last week. You can see the intense heat, how it warped these girders. These are ODOT photos. Now you can see the complete devastation from the fire of this playground. And a viewer made a comment to one of my recent videos about this bridge fire, is that the residue in the soil from this burnt plastic and burnt rubber is undoubtedly toxic. So what is being done, if anything, to evaluate the environmental hazard? Shouldn't that be part of this investigation? And I would think there would be some effort to expedite the cleanup to make it safe for not only construction crews, but for people who are using that park once this area is reopened. And there's a lot of information about the effects of burning plastic on air quality and public health. And all kinds of nasty byproducts are released from burning plastics, bisphenols and phthalates. These are all endocrine and neurodisruptors. So looking at this summary, this is from that Fox News story, I don't see any indication that an environmental assessment is part of the planned work. All right, let's just watch some more of this drone footage. We can see this false work tower, 6 individual towers to form a single line of support. Again, I'm not sure why there weren't 2 of these lines of support installed. Also, it's not clear if there's any damage to the reinforced concrete bridge piers. Another angle here. This shows you full on the area that was subject to the fire. We're looking off to the north here, more or less. This just shows you the overall orientation of this location of the bridge. The fire area is adjacent to this group of trees here. Another view of that. And for the channel members, I'm going to post the entirety of the drone footage here as a separate video. If you members want to check that out. I understand that the closure of the southbound lanes of this bridge has had major impacts to slowing traffic in surrounding roadways. I'm not sure what time this drone flight was performed, but obviously it wasn't done during rush hour. Again, the same area where you see the burnout area. So I'm going to pause it here for a second. This is the area I figured that would have been taken out in its entirety. Just would have planned it right out of the gate. So the area between these 2 piers, that they would have replaced all of the girders, certainly the concrete bridge deck, and hopefully the reinforced concrete bridge piers don't need to be replaced, because that would add a couple of weeks, I think, to the timeline for reconstruction. Pretty interesting looking bridge. They did a great job getting me a variety of angles at various elevations along this bridge. Again, another view coming into the burned area. I mean, I understand how this work needs to be done safely, but I think they could have concentrated their inspections on the interface to that span that was experienced all the intense heat. And if it looked to be in good shape, they could have just quickly planned to remove that single span. It would have been, I think, much quicker than what they're doing now. But, that's the other thing. If Ohio DOT has a good reason for doing what they're doing, tell people specifically what it is that you're thinking. I mean, they've been rather vague in this whole thing, and I don't know why. And that's my opinion. I initially gave them a lot of credit for jumping all over this, and I do think they did a great job in the initial phases, but I don't know if it's a communication issue or a planning issue, but I can certainly understand now the local frustration with how ODOT hasn't clearly outlined the path forward at this point. So I guess the pickleball courts are open. I didn't even know what pickleball was until I did this story. All right, so we're coming into the tail end of the footage that I'm going to include for this video. With that, I'd like to send a shout out to the channel members. I really appreciate your ongoing support, as well as those of you who have provided super thanks. I'll roll credits at the end. I'll continue to follow this story. If you have any thoughts about this situation, please let me know in the comments. So to recap, I indicated there'd be questions that if I were local and had the opportunity to ask ODOT officials these questions, this is what I would ask them. Why aren't they planning for our worst case scenario so they can order materials and put an upper bound on the timeline for getting this bridge reconstructed and reopened to traffic? When do they plan to start demolition work? Is it possible that in the course of demolition work, they're going to find other areas that need to be repaired or removed and replaced? Why aren't they simply expediting the repair by taking out the entire span that was subject to the playground fire? What are they doing, if anything, to ensure that other fires can't do damage to other bridges in their system? Also, I know there's little frustration that the fire officials haven't indicated the cause of this fire. I think they're just very methodically investigating it. And of course, that doesn't necessarily impact, or doesn't impact at all, the timeline for reconstruction and opening this roadway back up to traffic fully. But based on what I've seen, I think it's more likely than not that this was an arson fire. And if it was an arson fire, I'm really curious as to whether the intent was to just merely burn down the playground, which has happened in other places, or if it was arson, did the arsonist understand that they would do significant damage to the bridge by initiating this fire? So again, let me know what you think in the comments section, and please stay tuned for future videos.